At 0800 on November 16, 1944, Private First Class Leo, Runt, Vance crouched in the freezing mud of the Huerchen forest, watching the gray mist swirl between the pine trees like the breath of a dying giant. The air didn't smell like pine needles and fresh earth. It smelled of wet wool, cordite, and the rotting decay of a forest that had been chewing up armies for 2 months. To the generals back in the warm command tents, the Huerchen was just a patch of green on a map between Belgium and the Rhine River. To the men of the 28th Infantry Division, it was the green hell, a claustrophobic nightmare where the trees were so thick they blocked out the sun, and the mud was deep enough to suck the boots off a marching man. Vance shifted his weight, trying to find a foothold in the slush that didn't slip. He was 5'5" and weighed 130 pounds soaking wet. In a normal army, he would have been a clerk or a jeep driver. In the United States Army of 1944, he was the squad's automatic rifleman. Resting across his knees was the Browning automatic rifle, the M1918A2. It was a 20-pound slab of walnut stock and machined steel that was nearly as long as Vance was tall. The sergeant had assigned it to him as a joke, operating on the twisted military logic that you put the heaviest anchor on the smallest boat just to see if it floats. The bar was a legend of a weapon, designed by John Browning himself for the trenches of the First World War. It fired the heavy .30-06 cartridge, the same bullet used in the Moen-Garand rifle, but it fired them from a 20-round box magazine at a rate that could chop down a telephone pole. It was a beast of a gun, respected for its power but hated for its weight, and in the dense, tanglefoot undergrowth of the Huerchen forest, that weight was a death sentence. The vines grabbed the barrel, the low branches snagged the sights. Carrying the bar through this terrain was like trying to drag a stubborn mule through a briar patch. But the real problem wasn't carrying the gun, it was shooting it. The Army manual was very clear on how the bar was supposed to be used. It was a support weapon. The gunner was supposed to drop to the prone position, lie flat on his belly, unfold the heavy steel bipod attached to the muzzle, and fire controlled bursts to keep the enemy's heads down. It was a perfect theory for a shooting range in Georgia. It was a suicide note in the Huerchen forest. Here, the ground wasn't a flat field. It was a mess of shattered tree stumps, bomb craters, and tangles of roots that stuck up like rusty wire. If Vance tried to go prone, he wouldn't see anything but mud and wood. The bipod, meant to stabilize the weapon, was useless. It sank into the soft earth or got tangled in the ferns. To fight in this forest, you had to stand up. You had to shoot from the shoulder, and that was where the experts said the bar failed. The instructors back in boot camp had warned the men about the fast setting on the fire selector switch. The M1918 Atwo had 2 speeds: slow, which chugged along at about 350 rounds per minute, and fast, which ripped through the magazine at nearly 600 rounds per minute. The instructors called the fast setting a wild beast. They said that without the bipod to anchor it, the recoil would climb straight up to the sky. They said a man firing from the shoulder on fast would put his first round in the target's chest and his second round into the clouds. They laughed at the idea of controlling it, calling it an anti-aircraft mode for idiots who wanted to waste ammunition. Vance's squad felt the same way. They looked at the heavy bipod hanging off the end of his barrel and shook their heads. They knew that in a sudden ambush, Vance would never have time to drop down and set up. They called him the anchor, betting cigarettes on how fast he would tip over backward when the shooting started. They saw him as a liability, a walking noisemaker who couldn't hit the broad side of a barn unless he had 5 minutes to build a sandbag nest. Vance took the abuse in silence, but he felt the doubt gnawing at him. He knew the physics were against him. The .30-06 round was powerful. It kicked like a mule. When you fired 20 of them in 2 seconds, that kick became a continuous, violent shove that tried to rotate your body. Fighting that recoil with brute strength worked if you were a 6-foot farm boy who threw hay bales for a living. For a guy like Vance, brute strength wasn't an option. If he tried to wrestle the gun, he would lose. The patrol moved deeper into the gloom. The silence of the forest was heavy, broken only by the wet sound of boots squelching in the mud and the occasional snap of a twig. Every tree looked like a hiding spot. Every shadow looked like a German soldier. The enemy here wasn't the average conscript. They were Fallschirmjäger, German paratroopers. They were the elite. They knew how to wait. They knew how to let the point man walk past so they could kill the whole squad from behind. They didn't fear the Americans. They hunted them. Vance kept his thumb on the selector switch. The manual said to keep it on slow for walking fire. It said the slow rhythm allowed you to get the gun back on target between shots. But Vance looked at the dense wall of trees in front of him. If a German squad popped out of that mist at 10 yards, chugging along wasn't going to save him. He didn't need a steady rhythm. He needed a wall of lead. He needed violence. He looked at the bipod on the end of the barrel. It was 2 pounds of dead steel. It made the gun front heavy, dragging the muzzle down when he walked and catching on every vine in Germany. In his mind, he could hear the instructor's voice warning him that the bipod was his life. But the instructor wasn't here. The instructor was probably drinking coffee in a warm office while Vance was freezing to death in a hole. He made a decision. It was a small rebellion, imperceptible to the rest of the squad. He shifted his grip on the forend of the rifle. Instead of holding it underneath like a cradle, he wrapped his hand over the top of the heat shield, clamping his fingers down. It was an awkward grip, something that would burn his hand if he fired too long, but it locked the barrel into his left arm. He wasn't going to hold the gun up, he was going to hold it down. A sound cut through the damp air. It wasn't a twig snapping, it was the metallic sound of a bolt closing. Vance froze. The sound had come from a cluster of fir trees to his right, less than 20 yards away. The mist was thick there, turning the trees into gray ghosts. He squinted, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He saw it, a shape that was too straight to be a branch, the dull glint of a helmet rim. The German ambush was set. They were waiting for the squad to walk into the kill zone, a perfect L-shaped trap that would cut them down in a crossfire. Vance was on the flank. He was the only one with an angle on the enemy position. He didn't yell a warning. Yelling takes time. Yelling tells the enemy you see them. He didn't drop to the prone position. If he dropped, the 3-foot-high ferns would block his view, and he would be shooting blind at the tree tops. He had to stay standing. He had to be the thing the experts said was impossible. He thumbed the selector switch past slow. He pushed it all the way forward to fast. The mechanical engagement was loud in the silence. The German soldier in the trees turned his head. He saw Vance. He saw the small American standing in the open, holding the massive automatic rifle. The German raised his M40 submachine gun. He probably thought he had the advantage. He probably thought the little man with the big gun would be clumsy, slow, and easy to kill. Vance stepped forward, planting his left boot deep into the mud. He leaned into the weapon, putting his entire 130 pounds behind the steel butt plate. He didn't aim for the German's head. He aimed for the German's knee. The wild beast was about to wake up, and for the first time, Vance wasn't going to try to tame it. He was going to let it run. The instant Vance's finger crushed the trigger, the Browning automatic rifle stopped being a collection of steel parts and became a living, breathing animal in his hands. The first thing that happens when you fire a bar isn't the explosion, it's the shift in gravity. Because the weapon fires from an open bolt, the heavy steel slide assembly, a chunk of metal weighing nearly a pound, slams forward from the rear of the receiver with the force of a sliding jail door. That forward momentum hits the chamber a split second before the bullet fires, creating a distinct, heavy lurch that throws off the aim of anyone who isn't ready for it. The instructors called it the clunk. Vance called it the heartbeat. When the firing pin finally hit the primer, the 30-06 cartridge detonated with 50,000 pounds of pressure. On the fast setting, the mechanism didn't just cycle, it vibrated. The recoil hit Vance's shoulder not as a single kick, but as a continuous, jackhammering shove that tried to rotate his entire body to the right. This was the moment where the experts said the gun failed. They said the muzzle would climb uncontrollably, sending rounds into the tree canopy, wasting ammunition on the birds. They were right about the climb, but they were wrong about the waste. Vance didn't try to fight the climb. He didn't try to muscle the barrel back down to a stationary point like he was shooting at a paper target on a sunny range in Georgia. Instead, he let the gun do what it wanted to do. He let the muzzle rise, but he guided the direction, steering the bucking steel like a man riding a wild horse. The first bullet hit the German soldier in the left shin. It was a low shot, the kind of shot that would have earned Vance a failing grade in marksmanship school. But on the fast setting, the first bullet is just the opening statement. Before the German could even register the pain of his shattered leg, the recoil impulse lifted the barrel 6 inches. The second and third rounds struck him in the thigh and the hip, pulverizing the bone and spinning him around. The gun kept climbing. It chewed its way up the target's body in a jagged, vertical line of destruction. The fourth and fifth rounds caught the soldier in the chest, smashing through his ammunition pouches and his ribs. The final round of the burst took him in the neck, ending the fight before the empty brass casing of the first shot had even hit the mud. Vance released the trigger. The silence that rushed back into the forest was deafening. Smoke poured from the muzzle, hanging in the damp air like a gray curtain. The German soldier didn't fall like they did in the movies, gripping his chest and slumping over. He had been erased. The violent, vertical stitching of the automatic fire had hit him with the force of a freight train, throwing him backward into the brush, as if he had been yanked by a cable. Vance stood there, his breath pluming in the cold air, the heavy gun smoking in his hands. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, but his mind was racing. He looked at the gun. He looked at the empty space where the enemy had been standing. The uncontrollable climb hadn't been a flaw. It had been a targeting system. By aiming low and letting the recoil walk the fire up, he had created a zone of death that was impossible to survive. He hadn't needed to be precise. He hadn't needed to find the center mass. He just needed to start at the bottom and let the wild beast eat its way to the top. The rest of the squad stared at him. Private Miller, who had bet $5 that Vance would fall over, stood with his mouth open, his Moan Garand hanging uselessly at his side. They had expected a clumsy, rattling burst of noise. They had expected Vance to spray the trees. Instead, they had just watched the Runt dissect a German paratrooper with the surgical efficiency of a chainsaw. But the Huerchen forest doesn't give you time to celebrate. The shot had broken the standoff, and now the rest of the German patrol knew exactly where the Americans were. The mist to the right erupted with muzzle flashes. The sharp reports of German Carminus 98,000 rifles snapped through the trees, the bullets smacking into the trunks around Vance with the sound of angry hammers. The sergeant screamed from behind a fallen log, ordering Vance to get the gun down and get prone. Vance heard the order, but he knew it was a death sentence. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of dead pine needles, ferns, and shattered branches. If he dropped to his belly now, he would be blind. He would be shooting into the dirt while the Germans maneuvered around them. The textbook said to dig in. The reality of the green hell said to stay on your feet or die. He tried to move to a better position, a thick oak tree 5 yards to his left. He took a step, and the heavy steel bipod on the end of the barrel betrayed him. One of the legs snagged on a tangle of blackberry vines, jerking the muzzle down and nearly pulling the weapon out of his hands. Vance cursed, yanking the gun back. The bipod was a 2-pound anchor designed for a war that wasn't happening here. It was meant for the flat plains of Europe, not this tangled claustrophobia. It swung loose, rattling against the barrel, catching on every twig and root. It was the safety blanket the army insisted he needed, but right now, it was trying to get him killed. He ripped the gun free from the vines, tearing his uniform sleeve in the process. He didn't have a screwdriver. He didn't have a wrench. He couldn't take the bipod off. He had to fight the weapon just as much as he had to fight the Germans. He slammed his shoulder against the oak tree, using the bark to steady himself. The German fire was intensifying. They weren't just a patrol, they were the point element for something bigger. A machine gun, the terrified ripping sound of an MG-42, opened up from deeper in the woods. The bullets shredded the bark of Vance's tree, sending splinters flying into his face. The Germans were using grazing fire, keeping their bullets knee-high to catch anyone trying to crawl. The sergeant was pinned. The rest of the squad was hugging the dirt, unable to lift their heads without getting a haircut. They needed fire superiority. They needed volume. They needed the bar. Vance looked at the bipod again. He reached forward and slammed the legs upward, locking them against the barrel. They wouldn't stay there, the recoil would shake them loose, but it was the best he could do. He checked the magazine. He had fired maybe 6 rounds, 14 left in the box. He didn't reload. In a fight this fast, you run the gun dry before you swap. He peered around the side of the oak tree. The mist was thinning slightly, revealing the shapes of the enemy. There were 3 of them, moving in a crouched run, using the distraction of the MG-42 to flank the squad. They were moving from tree to tree, closing the distance. They were aggressive, confident, and fast. They knew the Americans were pinned. They were coming to finish the job with grenades. Vance knew he couldn't pick them off one by one. The bolt-action rifles of the snipers worked by patience. The bar worked by violence. If he tried to aim at the first man, fire, stop, aim at the second man, fire and stop, the third man would kill him. The cycle time of acquiring a target, aligning the sights and squeezing the trigger was too slow. He needed something faster. He remembered the first kill. He remembered the climb. A crazy idea formed in his head. It was the kind of idea that would get him court-martialed if he explained it to an officer. The manual said to treat multiple targets as separate engagements. It said to reset the weapon between shots. But the manual assumed the gun was uncontrollable. What if he didn't reset? What if he used the recoil not just to climb vertically, but to sweep horizontally? The physics of the bar meant that it pulled up and to the right. It was a natural diagonal line. If he started at the bottom left of the enemy formation and just held the trigger down, the gun would naturally stitch a line across the squad. He wouldn't be aiming at men. He would be painting a slash of lead across the space they occupied. It was risky. If he missed, he would empty the magazine in 2 seconds and be standing there with an empty gun and 3 angry Germans in his face. He would be the anchor who sank the squad. The 3 Germans broke cover, rushing toward a depression in the ground 20 yards away. They were bunched up, shoulder to shoulder, confident in their momentum. Vance stepped out from behind the oak tree. He didn't drop to a knee. He planted his feet wide, leaning forward until his nose was almost touching the receiver. He flared his left elbow out, locking the heat shield into a vice grip. He looked at the lead German's boots. He He didn't think about windage. He didn't think about elevation. He thought about a diagonal line, a slash of chalk across a blackboard. He flipped the safety off. The wild beast was hungry. The Germans saw him. The lead soldier shouted something, raising his rifle. But he was operating on human time. See, decide, act. Vance was operating on machine time. He slammed the trigger back and held it. The bar roared. It didn't chug, it screamed. The sound was a continuous tearing sheet of noise that drowned out the MG-42, the shouting, and the pounding of Vance's own heart. The stock hammered into his shoulder, pushing him backward, but he leaned into it, feeding the recoil with his own body weight. The muzzle climbed. It wasn't a straight vertical line this time. Vance twisted his torso slightly to the left, fighting the gun's natural drift to the right. The result was a perfect diagonal sweep. The first stream of bullets chewed into the lead soldier's legs and groin, folding him like a cheap lawn chair. But the gun didn't stop. The recoil carried the muzzle up and to the right, seamlessly transferring the fire to the second man. The bullets caught him in the chest and throat, the heavy .30-06 rounds punching through him and throwing him sideways into the third man. The gun kept climbing. It was hungry for the third man. The third German soldier didn't even have time to scream. The final rounds of the burst caught him mid-dive, the heavy .30-06 slugs punching through his helmet and snapping his head back with the violence of a car crash. He hit the ground dead, sliding in the mud until he came to rest against the boots of the man who had fallen seconds before him. Vance stood in the clearing, the Browning automatic rifle smoking in his hands. The silence that followed the roar of the gun was heavier than the noise. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The rest of the American squad lay pressed into the dirt, staring at the carnage. They looked at the 3 dead Germans, torn apart as if they had walked into a propeller. Then they looked at Vance. The Runt was still standing, his chest heaving, steam rising from the barrel of the weapon that was supposed to be too big for him. He hadn't fired a clumsy, wild burst. He had painted a perfect diagonal stripe of death across the enemy formation. The sergeant was the first to break the spell. He scrambled up from behind the log, his eyes wide. He didn't yell at Vance to get prone anymore. He pointed toward the tree line where the rest of the German force was massing. The ambush Vance had just broken was only the tip of the spear. The main body of the Fallschirmjäger platoon was pushing through the timber, shouting orders, moving to flank the Americans before they could recover. Vance didn't need orders. He ripped the empty magazine out of the bottom of the rifle. The release lever was stiff, but adrenaline made his thumb strong enough to punch through a brick wall. The empty steel box clattered onto the roots, and he slammed a fresh 20-round magazine into the well. He didn't gently seat it. He hammered it home with the heel of his hand until it clicked. He racked the charging handle back. The heavy slide moved with the sound of a closing bank vault. The Germans were smart. They knew the location of the automatic rifle now. They knew it was the only thing stopping them from overrunning the squad. A machine gun team, 2 men carrying an MG-42 and boxes of ammunition, sprinted toward a cluster of rocks 30 yards away. If they set up that Hitler's buzzsaw, they would cut the squad to ribbons in seconds. Vance didn't look for cover. Cover blocked his field of fire. He stepped out away from the oak tree, planting his boots in the slush. He saw the machine gunner diving for the rocks. A sniper or a rifleman would have tried to lead the target, calculating the speed and distance. Vance didn't do math, he did geometry. He swung the heavy barrel low, aiming at the gap between the trees where the runners had to pass. He clamped the trigger down. The bar screamed again. The fast setting devoured the ammunition, sending 10 rounds a second downrange. Vance didn't try to hold the gun still. He leaned into the recoil, using the massive vibration to oscillate the muzzle back and forth in a tight figure-8 pattern. He created a beaten zone, a wall of flying lead that no living thing could pass through. The German machine gunner ran straight into it. The bullets hit him in the legs and torso, knocking him sideways. The gun flew out of his hands, landing in the mud. His assistant tried to stop, tried to turn back, but the wild beast was already climbing. Vance let the recoil carry the aim up and to the right, sweeping the second man with a burst that tore through the trees and the soldier hiding behind them. The heat coming off the barrel was intense. The wooden forend was smoking, the varnish bubbling and turning black. Vance could feel the heat radiating through his glove, stinging his palm, but he couldn't let go. He was the anchor. If he stopped shooting, the line broke. He was down to his last 4 magazines, 80 rounds. That was maybe 8 seconds of trigger time on the fast setting. He had to make every burst count. The Germans changed tactics. They stopped trying to rush the position. They started throwing grenades. The dark iron eggs came sailing through the mist, landing with heavy thuds in the soft earth. One exploded 10 feet from Vance, sending a spray of hot mud and shrapnel into the air. A piece of hot steel sliced his cheek, but he barely felt it. The concussion rattled his teeth, but it didn't knock him down. He saw the thrower. a German arm swung out from behind a thick pine tree. Vance didn't wait for the man to show himself. He used the power of the .30-06 round. The experts said you shouldn't shoot at trees because wood stops bullets. That might be true for a pistol or a carbine. It wasn't true for the bar. The heavy armor-piercing rounds carried enough energy to punch through 12 inches of pine and still kill the man on the other side. Vance aimed at the center of the tree trunk. He unleashed a 5-round burst. Bark exploded from the tree as if a stick of dynamite had gone off inside it. Wood chips the size of dinner plates flew into the air. The bullets smashed through the trunk, exiting out the back in a cloud of splinters. The German soldier behind the tree crumpled, falling into view with his chest shattered by wood and lead. The squad was rallying now. The riflemen, emboldened by Vance's display, began to return fire. The ping of Moan Garand clips ejecting joined the roar of the bar, but the Germans still had the numbers. They were pushing hard on the left flank, trying to encircle the position. Vance saw the movement. A squad of 5 Germans was crawling through a drainage ditch, using the low ground to sneak up on the sergeant. They were invisible to the rest of the squad. Only Vance, standing upright in the open, had the angle to see them. He ran. He didn't run away, he ran toward them. He sprinted 10 yards across the open clearing, mud splashing up to his knees, bullets snapping past his head like angry bees. He dove behind a fallen log that overlooked the ditch. He didn't bother with the bipod. He slammed the barrel of the bar onto the rotting wood of the log, using his left hand to pin it down. The Germans in the ditch looked up. They saw the muzzle of the bar staring down at them from 10 yards away. It was the last thing they ever saw. Vance pulled the trigger and didn't let go. He burned the entire 20-round magazine in one long, continuous roar. He swept the ditch from front to back, the gun bucking and jumping like a jackhammer. The brass casings poured out of the ejection port, bouncing off the log, burning his neck, falling into his collar. He didn't care. He watched the ditch turn into a chaotic storm of mud, water, and destruction. The bolt locked back on an empty chamber. The gun was smoking so badly now that Vance could taste the burning wood. He rolled onto his back, gasping for air, his hands shaking so hard he fumbled the reload. He grabbed a fresh magazine from his belt. His fingers were slick with mud and sweat. He jammed the magazine in, rolled back over and racked the slide. But the ditch was silent. Nothing moved. The wild beast had eaten. The German assault was stalling. They had lost their machine gun. They had lost their flankers. They had lost their momentum. The psychological impact of a single automatic weapon firing without pause was breaking their nerve. They didn't know it was one small man with a hot gun. They thought they had run into a fortified bunker. But the final test was coming. Through the smoke, a German officer stood up. He was screaming at his men, waving a pistol, trying to force them to charge one last time. He was brave, or maybe he was just desperate. He rallied 3 survivors and led them in a final, suicidal rush straight at the log. Vance raised the gun. The heat from the barrel was now searing his hand through the leather glove. The air around the muzzle was shimmering with thermal distortion, making the targets look like they were underwater. He aimed at the officer. He pulled the trigger. The gun didn't fire. It wasn't empty. It was a jam. The heat had swollen a casing, or the mud had finally worked its way into the action. The open bolt slammed forward but didn't detonate the round. The officer was 20 yards away and closing fast. He raised his pistol. Vance didn't panic. He didn't look for his own pistol. He used the bar. He racked the charging handle back with a violent jerk, ripping the stuck round out of the chamber. The hot brass flew into the mud. He let the slide fly forward again. It was a gamble. If the gun was broken, he was dead. The officer fired his pistol. The bullet struck the log inches from Vance's face, spraying him with rotten wood pulp. Vance squeezed the trigger. The gun roared to life. It hadn't failed him. It had just hesitated. The burst hit the officer in the chest, stopping him mid-stride. Vance didn't let up. He shifted the fire to the men behind him, the diagonal slash coming naturally now. A muscle memory burned into his arms. He walked the fire right through the group, knocking them down like bowling pins. The last German fell 5 yards from the log. Vance held the trigger down for an extra second, sending the final rounds into the dirt, making sure nothing was getting up. The bolt locked back. The magazine was empty. He reached for his belt. Empty. He had fired every single round he carried. 300 rounds of .30-06 ammunition in less than 10 minutes. He slumped against the log, the empty gun resting on his chest. The barrel was gray-white with heat. The wood of the forend was charred black. He could smell the burning varnish, the hot steel, and the copper. His shoulder felt like it had been hit with a sledgehammer. His ears were ringing so loud he couldn't hear the rain starting to fall, but he could feel the vibration still humming in his bones. The uncontrollable gun sat quiet in his hands. It wasn't a wild beast anymore. It was a loyal dog that had fought until its heart nearly burst. The rest of the squad slowly stood up from the mud. They walked forward, their rifles lowered. They looked at the ditch. They looked at the machine gun team. They looked at the bodies in front of the log. The sergeant walked up to Vance. He looked at the smoking ruin of the bar. He looked at the runt, who was covered in mud, blood, and spent brass. The sergeant didn't make a joke about anchors. He didn't check the manual. He reached into his own webbing, pulled out a fresh magazine for his own Thompson submachine gun, and handed it to Vance. It wouldn't fit the bar, but the gesture was clear. The sergeant asked if he was okay, his voice rough with relief. Vance looked at the gun. He patted the hot receiver with a blistered hand and whispered that she bucked a little, but she rode just fine. The silence that followed the shooting was heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on the ears. Just seconds ago, the clearing had been a cacophony of screaming metal and tearing wood. Now the only sound was the hiss of rain hitting the hot barrel of the Browning automatic rifle. Private First Class Leo, Runt, Vance sat slumped against the wet log, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon. He looked down at the weapon in his lap. The steel receiver was radiating heat like a wood stove, warming his chest through the layers of his uniform. The walnut forend, usually a polished dark brown, was charred black and smoking, filling the air with the sharp, chemical smell of burning varnish. The wild beast was finally asleep, but it had taken everything Vance had to put it there. The rest of the squad emerged from the mud like ghosts rising from the grave. They moved slowly, their eyes wide, their rifles held low. They walked past Vance, giving him a wide berth, as if he were unexploded ordnance that might go off again. They approached the line of German bodies near the ditch. The experts back in the rear always talked about field of fire and tactical overlapping, but what the squad saw wasn't tactical. It was a demolition site. The trees behind the Germans were shredded, turning into white splinters by the heavy .30-06 rounds. The ground was churned into a soup of mud and brass. And the Germans themselves were broken, testifying to the terrifying power of an automatic weapon that didn't just suppress, it dismantled. The sergeant walked over to the log where Vance was sitting. This was the man who had assigned the 20-pound gun to the smallest guy in the squad as a joke. He looked at the smoking barrel, then at Vance's blistered hands, and finally at the dead officer lying 10 yards away. He didn't say a word. He reached into his webbing, pulled out a canteen, and unscrewed the cap. He handed it to Vance. It was the ultimate gesture of respect in the infantry. In the green hell, water was life, and you didn't share it with a liability. You shared it with a killer. Vance took the canteen, his hands shaking so hard he spilled half of it down his chin, but the water tasted like the best thing he had ever had. The patrol moved out 10 minutes later, leaving the carnage behind for the forest to reclaim, but the dynamic of the squad had shifted permanently. Vance wasn't the anchor anymore. He was the point of the spear. When the squad moved through the dense pines, they didn't look at the heavy bipod snagging on the vines and roll their eyes. They looked at it and remembered the sound of the gun tearing the German ambush apart. They walked a little taller, knowing that if the green hell decided to spit out another squad of paratroopers, they had a dragon on a leash who knew exactly when to let it off the chain. The battle for the Huerchen forest would drag on for another month, a meat grinder that would eventually cost the American army 33,000 casualties. It was a battle of attrition, fought in conditions that broke men's minds as often as their bodies. The cold, the damp, and the constant artillery barrages turned the forest into a graveyard of shattered trees and shattered men. But in that misery, the story of the Runt and his uncontrollable gun became a piece of frontline folklore. It passed from foxhole to foxhole, changing with every retelling. In some versions, he killed 10 men. In others, he cut a tree down with bullets to crush a tank. But the truth was more important than the myth. The truth was that a soldier had taken a flawed weapon and turned its greatest weakness into a strength. The experts at the Ordnance Department had designed the bar to be fired from a bipod because they thought the recoil was a problem to be solved. They thought the muzzle climb was a failure of engineering. Vance proved that in the chaotic, split-second reality of close-quarters combat, the muzzle climb was a feature. He proved that you didn't need to fight the weapon. You needed to understand it. By riding the recoil instead of resisting it, he had turned a clumsy support weapon into a scythe that cleared the path for his brothers. Vance survived the Huerchen forest, though he left a piece of his hearing and most of his innocence in the mud. He carried the bar all the way to the Rhine River, fighting through the Battle of the Bulge and into Germany itself. He never put the bipod back on the ground. He never switched the selector switchback to slow. He kept the beast on a short leash, ready to let it run whenever the world got too loud. He learned to live with the burns on his hands and the permanent bruise on his shoulder. They were the price of admission for survival. After the war, the army eventually phased out the Browning automatic rifle. It was heavy, expensive to manufacture, and outdated compared to the new generation of light machine guns. The M60 would eventually replace it, a weapon with a belt feed and a quick-change barrel. The experts called it an upgrade. They cited statistics about rate of fire and weight reduction. But for the men who had walked through the green hell, there would never be another weapon like the bar. It was a piece of iron and wood that felt like it had a soul. It was a gun that demanded respect, and if you gave it that respect, it would walk you through the valley of the shadow of death and bring you out the other side. Leo Vance went back to civilian life in 1945. He returned to his job at a hardware store in Pennsylvania, a quiet man who walked with a slight stoop in his right shoulder. He never talked about the war. He never joined the VFW or marched in parades. When customers complained about the weight of a bag of concrete or a box of nails, he would just smile a thin, tired smile and carry it out to their car without a word. He knew what heavy really felt like. Heavy wasn't 20 pounds of steel. Heavy was the silence of a forest waiting to kill you. But sometimes on the 4th of July, when the fireworks started popping and the smell of sulfur filled the summer air, his family would notice him tense up. They would see his left hand curl into a claw, as if he were gripping something that wasn't there. They didn't know he was holding the heat shield. They didn't know he was feeling the heavy steel slide slamming home. They didn't know that for a split second, he was back in the mist, riding the lightning, painting a diagonal slash across the nightmare to keep his friends alive. We rescue these stories to ensure that men like Leo, Runt, Vance don't disappear into the history books as just another statistic. It is easy to look at the casualty numbers of the Huerchen forest and see only a tragedy. It is easy to look at the design flaws of the bar and see only an obsolete relic, but history isn't made by numbers or blueprints. It is made by the guy in the mud who refuses to give up. It is made by the soldier who looks at an impossible situation and decides to break the rules to survive. Vance reminds us that the textbook solution isn't always the right one. Sometimes, you have to throw the manual in the mud and trust your gut. The next time you see a picture of a World War II soldier carrying that long, heavy automatic rifle, don't just see a piece of equipment. See the bruise on his shoulder. See the burns on his hands. See the terrifying responsibility of being the man who has to stand up when everyone else is pinning their face to the dirt. Remember that he is carrying the weight of the whole squad on his back. And remember that in the right hands, even a wild beast can save the day. If this story of the uncontrollable gun and the soldier who tamed it kept you glued to the screen, please hit that like button. It helps us fight the algorithm and keep these gritty details of history alive. Subscribe for more microhistory that digs into the forgotten heroes and weapons of World War II, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a video. Here is the question I want to leave you with. The bar was notoriously heavy and difficult to control, but it fired a massive, full-power rifle cartridge. Modern squads use lighter machine guns that fire smaller bullets. Do you think the trade-off was worth it? Would you rather have the raw, heavy power of the bar or the lightweight control of a modern weapon? Drop a comment below and let me know. Would you take the wild beast into the forest, or would you leave it for the experts? I read every comment. Thanks for watching, and thank you for helping us preserve the legacy of the men who rode the recoil.